Among colourful shelves and children's laughter, the millionaire sought a simple gift until fate froze him. His ex-wife was there, choosing clothes for 3 identical babies. If you enjoy emotional dramas, subscribe to the channel and comment now from where you are listening. Continuing. The March sun shone brightly on the pavements of Chelsea when Edward Mendelssohn parked his silver BMW in front of the small children's clothing store. It was a morning like many others, full of meetings, urgent phone calls, and decisions that moved millions of pounds. But there he was, a 42-year-old man accustomed to erecting skyscrapers, about to enter a store filled with teddy bears and colourful mobiles. The reason was simple. His partner Robert had become a father for the 3rd time, and Edward felt he needed to make a gesture, buy something special. He wasn't the type to worry about such formalities, but lately he had been trying to be more attentive, more present in personal relationships. Perhaps it was the loneliness that was beginning to weigh on him. Or perhaps it was just the realization that building relationships required the same care he dedicated to his ventures. He adjusted his navy blue tie, took a deep breath, and pushed open the store's glass door. The golden bell announced his entry with a gentle chime, and the aroma of talcum powder and lavender immediately enveloped him. It was a world completely different from his office on the 30th floor, with a view of Regent's Park. Edward was walking between the shelves, observing with some curiosity the educational toys and tiny clothes, when his world stopped. There, a few feet away, was Helen Carter, the woman who had been his wife for 6 years and who had disappeared from his life overnight, 18 months ago, without explanations, without arguments, with nothing but a cold note saying she needed time. She was leaning over a triple stroller, arranging the blankets of 3 identical babies who slept peacefully. Her light brown hair fell over her shoulders in the same way he remembered, and when she turned slightly, Edward could see the delicate profile he had so often contemplated in silence during the breakfasts they shared. Edward's heart pounded. The children seemed to be only a few months old, exactly the age they would be if they were his. The math was simple and painful. If Helen was pregnant when she left him, if she had hidden a triplet pregnancy, if she had fled to have the children away from him, then... Helen felt his gaze on her and looked up. For a moment, time simply ceased to exist. They stared at each other across the store, surrounded by colourful toys and children's music coming from a nearby music box. Her green eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself with that serenity that had always characterized her, even in the most difficult moments. Edward approached slowly, as if walking on unstable ground. Each step echoed in his mind along with 1,000 questions that tumbled over each other in his thoughts. "Helen," he said, trying to control his voice, trying to sound casual, "what a coincidence to find you here." She smiled, but it was a tense, guarded smile. "Edward, I didn't expect to see you here either." His eyes inevitably turned to the triple stroller. The 3 children were absurdly similar, with tufts of dark hair and the rosy faces of those sleeping deeply. Edward felt his stomach clench. Are they yours?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Helen hesitated for a second that seemed like an eternity. "I'm looking after them," she replied, choosing her words carefully. The answer was too evasive, and Edward knew Helen well enough to know when she was avoiding something. During their years of marriage, he had learned to read between the lines of her silences, but this time the silence seemed to carry secrets he couldn't decipher. "They're beautiful," he said, genuinely moved as he observed the babies. "How old are they?" 4.5 months, Helen replied, and Edward felt the world spin slightly. 4.5 months, plus 9 months of gestation. 14.5 months. Helen had disappeared 18 months ago. The math added up in a way that left him simultaneously hopeful and desperate. They talked for a few more minutes, exchanging empty words about the weather, about how busy London was, about anything that wasn't the questions that truly mattered. Helen quickly paid for her purchases, a pack of nappies and some tiny clothes, and bid him farewell with the same distant politeness as always. Edward stood in the middle of the store, watching her leave with the triple stroller, feeling like a man who had just seen a ghost who perhaps carried with her the children he never knew he would have. Back in his penthouse apartment in Chelsea, Edward couldn't concentrate on anything. The panoramic view that always calmed him now seemed insignificant compared to the turmoil in his chest. He tried to work, analyze blueprints for a new development in Canary Wharf, but the lines blurred before his eyes. For years, Edward Mendelsohn had been the man who controlled everything. He controlled multi-million-pound budgets, teams of hundreds of employees, tight schedules, and demanding clients. He had built an empire in the construction industry through meticulous planning and quick decisions. But there, alone in his luxurious apartment, he felt completely lost. Doubt gnawed at him like acid. Were they his children? Why had Helen left without saying anything? Why hadn't she told him about the pregnancy? What had he done so terrible to deserve being excluded from his own children's lives? On the third day after the encounter, Edward made a decision that went against all his principles of giving others space. He hired Mark Vickers, a discreet private investigator who had previously worked for his company on unfair competition cases. It wasn't pride that moved him, but a visceral need to understand what had happened to his life. In less than a week, Mark returned with information that left Edward even more confused. Helen lived in Notting Hill, in an old and charming townhouse on Portobello Road, far from the luxury she had known when they were married. She lived simply, almost modestly, and shared the house with a young woman who seemed to be her younger sister. Edward knew Sophia, Helen's younger sister, but she had always been a distant presence in their lives. He vaguely remembered a shy teenager who occasionally appeared at Sunday lunches at his mother-in-law's house. Now, apparently, the two lived together and cared for the triplets, but there was something more in Mark's information, something that made Edward's stomach clench in a different way. Sophia had a history of psychiatric hospitalizations, bipolar disorder, according to the medical records the investigator had managed to access. Edward spent the entire night awake, pacing back and forth in his apartment, trying to piece together a puzzle that only seemed to get more complicated. If the children were Sophia's and not Helen's, then why had his ex-wife disappeared? Why had she taken responsibility for her nieces and nephews? And why had she fled from him? The next morning, driven by a mixture of anxiety and determination, Edward decided to go to Notting Hill. He needed answers, even if it meant invading the space Helen had built away from him. The bohemian neighborhood contrasted drastically with the corporate world where Edward lived. The narrow, winding streets, the colorful colonial houses, the artist studios and the indie bars created an atmosphere he rarely experienced. It was like entering a London that existed parallel to his own, but which he had never truly known. When he arrived at the address Mark had provided, Edward stopped the car and watched the house from a distance. It was a yellow townhouse with blue windows, small but cozy, with a front garden full of tropical plants. He could hear laughter coming from the backyard. He got out of the car slowly and approached the wrought-iron gate. Through the bars, he saw a scene that left him paralyzed. Helen was sitting on a picnic blanket on the lawn, with the 3 babies around her. Beside her, a young woman with curly hair and a wide smile played with one of the triplets, making funny faces that drew giggles from the child. It was Sophia, no doubt. Older than Edward remembered, but with the same green eyes of the Carter family and the same natural grace as her sister. The two seemed perfectly at ease, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Edward stood there, observing that scene of domestic happiness, feeling like an intruder. For the first time in many years, he wondered if his presence would be welcome anywhere. Edward took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the garden, and the 2 women looked up in his direction. Sophia smiled shyly and waved, but Helen slowly stood up, with an expression that mixed surprise and apprehension. "Edward," she said, walking to the gate. "What are you doing here?" There was no hostility in her voice, just weariness, a weariness Edward recognized because it was the same he had been feeling for 18 months. "I need to talk to you, Helen. Please." She hesitated for a moment, looked back to where Sophia continued playing with the children, and then opened the gate. "Let's talk out front here," she said, indicating 2 wicker chairs on the porch. "The children are enjoying themselves." Edward sat down, trying to organize all the questions that tormented him in his mind, but when he opened his mouth, what came out was simpler and more direct than he expected. "Are they my children, Helen?" The question hung in the air between them. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for a conversation she knew would be inevitable. "No, Edward, they are not your children." The answer should have been a relief, but Edward felt a pang of disappointment that surprised him. For days, he had imagined being a father. He had created a connection with those 3 children in his mind. "They are Sophia's children," Helen continued, her voice low but firm. "Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael, the triplets who completely changed my life." Edward leaned forward, trying to understand. "But why did you leave everything to take care of them? Why did you disappear without explaining anything to me?" Helen sighed deeply, and for the first time Edward saw in her eyes all the pain she had carried alone. Sophia got pregnant at 21. The children's father disappeared when he found out they would be triplets. She had a crisis. Edward, a severe crisis. She was hospitalized for almost the entire pregnancy. Edward vaguely remembered Helen going out frequently during the last months of their marriage, claiming she had family commitments. At the time, he was too involved with the launch of a new venture to pay attention. "When the babies were born," Helen continued, "Sophia couldn't take care of them. She was medicated, confused, scared. I visited her at the maternity ward and—" Helen stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "I held Gabriel in my arms and knew I couldn't abandon them. They needed me. But why didn't you tell me? Why did you just disappear?" Helen turned to look at him directly, and Edward saw years of accumulated hurt in her gaze. "Because you would have stopped me, Edward. You would have calculated the costs, analyzed the risks, shown me spreadsheets proving it was a mistake. You would have sold some of my assets to fund her treatments, as you did with my grandmother's house when your company needed capital." The blow was direct. Edward remembered the time he had to sell the Carter family's century-old house to save the construction company from a financial crisis. He had made the decision alone, believing he was protecting their future. Helen had never completely forgiven that attitude. "I knew if I stayed, you would convince me that I was being too emotional, too impulsive, and I couldn't take that risk. Sophia and the children needed all of me, not the version of me that tried to please you." Edward felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. For the first time, he saw himself through Helen's eyes, and the image was not pretty. He saw a man who made decisions for others, who believed he knew what was best for everyone, who transformed love into control. In the days that followed, Edward couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. He returned to work, but the meetings seemed empty, the profits insignificant. He had built an empire, but he had destroyed his family. He had accumulated riches, but he had lost the wealth that mattered most. A week later, he appeared again at the gate of the house in Notting Hill. This time, he carried bags with nappies, clothes, and educational toys. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said when Helen answered. "I came to help. If you'll let me." Helen watched him for a long moment, trying to read his intentions. "Edward, this isn't a business transaction. It's not something you can solve with money." "I know," he replied, and for the first time in years, his voice carried genuine humility. "But I can learn." And so began the most difficult transformation of Edward Mendelssohn's life. He started visiting the house regularly, always asking beforehand if he could help. At first, Sophia was suspicious of him, but little by little she realized that the man in the suit was genuinely interested in learning about the children's routine. Edward discovered that changing nappies required much more delicacy than signing multi-million-pound contracts. He learned that making a baby stop crying at 3 a.m. was more challenging than negotiating with international investors. He discovered that Gabriel's smile when he sang a clumsy lullaby was worth more than any applause at corporate awards. But the decisive moment came on an October night, when Sophia had a severe crisis. Edward was at the house, helping Helen bathe the triplets, when they heard Sophia screaming in the bedroom. She was in a frenzy, convinced that someone wanted to steal her children. On an impulse, Sophia grabbed the 3 babies and fled the house barefoot in the middle of the night. Edward and Helen desperately ran after her, searching the winding streets of Notting Hill. It was Edward who found her, 2 hours later, sitting in an abandoned playground, clutching the 3 babies who were crying from hunger and cold. "Sophia," he said, approaching slowly, as if she were a frightened animal. "It's me, Edward. I've come to get you." She looked at him with glazed eyes, lost between reality and the ghosts of her mind. "They want to take my babies," she murmured. "I can't let them." Edward knelt on the dirty ground of the playground, not caring about the £3,000 suit he was ruining. He extended his arms, and with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed, hugged Sophia and the 3 children. "No one will take them, Sophia. I promise. Let's go home." That night, holding a woman in crisis and 3 frightened babies, Edward understood the true meaning of responsibility. It wasn't about controlling or deciding for others. It was about being present when the world crumbled. From that moment on, Helen began to see him with different eyes. He was no longer the cold businessman who calculated everything in terms of profit and loss. He was a man learning to build bonds with the same determination with which he erected buildings. But the greatest proof of his transformation was yet to come. 3 months later, Edward discovered that one of the plots of land he had bought years earlier, in the heart of Notting Hill, was being quoted by an international developer for a £1 billion project. The same plot of land was 2 blocks from the house where Helen, Sophia, and the triplets lived. The project envisioned the demolition of dozens of historic houses for the construction of a luxury apartment complex. It would be the largest undertaking of Edward's career, with profits that would surpass everything he had ever achieved. Edward spent entire nights studying the blueprints, calculating the numbers, analyzing the impact. The project was perfect from a financial point of view, but it would mean the destruction of the community where everything he now loved lived. The next morning, Edward called an extraordinary meeting with his company's board. Before surprised investors, he made 2 revelations that changed his life forever. First, he confessed that during the economic crisis of previous years, he had made questionable decisions to keep the company afloat. He had diverted resources, manipulated contracts, falsified reports. He offered his resignation and was prepared to answer for all his actions. Second, he announced that he was withdrawing the Notting Hill land from the development project. Instead, he would donate part of the land for the construction of a community centre with a daycare and allocate the profits from the coming years to social projects focused on families with special needs. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. But after a long deliberation, the investors made a decision that surprised everyone, especially Edward. They decided to keep him as CEO, impressed by his honesty and the vision of social responsibility he presented. "Edward," said Charles Miller, the chairman of the board, "in 20 years of business, I've never seen anyone give up so much profit for a matter of principle. That's worth more than any venture." When Edward arrived at the Notting Hill house that afternoon, Helen was in the garden watering the plants while the triplets slept in the shade of a mango tree. He told her everything that had happened, from the confession in the office to the decision about the land. Helen listened in silence, and when he finished, she approached and hugged him for the first time in 2 years. "You really have changed," she whispered, her voice choked. "The Edward I knew would never have given up a project of that size." "The Edward you knew never had a reason to change," he replied, holding her tightly. "Now I do." That night, while helping to bottle feed Raphael, the calmest of the triplets, Edward reflected on his journey. He had started as a man who built empires of concrete and ended as someone who learned to build bonds with his heart. Months later, when Sophia was stable in her treatment and the triplets were already crawling around the house, Helen and Edward remarried. It was a simple ceremony in the garden of the Notting Hill house, with Sophia as maid of honor and the 3 boys as honorary page boys. That day, Edward understood that he had found something much more valuable than all the ventures he had erected. He had found an imperfect one but real family, a family not based on contracts or agreements, but on daily love, constant presence, and commitment renewed with each dawn. The man who once believed that to love was to control, learned that to love was to liberate, and in the end, he realized that true construction was not made of bricks and cement, but of shared moments, granted forgiveness, and second chances embraced with gratitude. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Edward, Helen, and Sophia has deeply touched your hearts. If this story of redemption, love, and second chances moved you as much as it moved us in telling it, please like, subscribe to our channel, and share in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it the reunion at the Chelsea store? The night Edward hugged Sophia in the playground, or perhaps his courageous decision to give up the multi-million-pound project. Every day we bring you stories like this, which reveal the most human and transformative side of love. Stories that remind us that it is never too late to start over, to ask for forgiveness, to build bridges where walls once stood. We'll meet in the next episode, where a new emotion awaits you.